Before I start with the sermon this morning, I want to encourage you to consider being part of the new small groups that are forming at Oconee Street to address white supremacy and how we have internalized and participated in it. These groups are about doing the anti-racist inner work and doing it as part of our Christian discipleship, and they're going to be powerfully transformative for everybody who's involved. You can sign up now through August 12th. And there's a Google form posted in the church's Facebook group. Now, if you're not in that group, or if you're new to Oconee Street but still want to participate, which you are invited to do, absolutely, please send an email with your name and stating your interest to oconeestreetumc@gmail.com. That's listed on the website. You can invite friends who are not part of this congregation to participate too. I'm really excited that this ministry is happening here, and the facilitators that are making this happen are so talented and so passionate. I really hope that you will consider being part of this important work. So over on Preacher Twitter this week, a debate has been raging that has pitted colleague against colleague, seminary classmate against seminary classmate, podcast hosted by a bunch of white guys against other podcast hosted by a different bunch of white guys. And that debate, dear friends, is about why Peter got out of the boat. So let's recap this passage before we engage the controversy. After feeding a huge crowd of people, Jesus sends the disciples on ahead of him by boat. Jesus stays behind to pray alone. While the disciples are in the boat crossing this lake, a storm blows up, and this is not uncommon on the Sea of Galilee. So in the midst of this storm, they then see Jesus, who, remember, they had left behind on solid land, walking towards them across the water. They are convinced that they're seeing a ghost. But then Jesus calls out and tells them that it's him and not to fear. Peter, however, can't really believe this and calls out to Jesus saying, "If it's really you, command me to walk out to you." And Jesus does, and Peter steps out of the boat in the middle of a storm to walk to Jesus. And as he does, he realizes exactly what he's doing, and he begins to sink. Jesus grabs him and asks why he would doubt. When the two return to the boat, the storm stops, and all the disciples worship Jesus and declare that he really is God's Son. I think it's important for us to get straight that this is the second boat in a storm story that we have in Matthew, and that the first one is that one where Jesus is asleep and the disciples think that the boat is going to sink, and so they wake Jesus up, and he calms the storm with just a word. That is a different story and a different storm from the one we're reading now. In this story, we should notice that the disciples aren't actually afraid of the storm itself. They seem to be managing that just fine. They only are scared when they notice that there is a guy walking on water across out to them, and they think they're seeing a ghost. So on the one side of this debate, we have the position that Peter's act of walking towards Jesus was an act of great faith. Personally, I have heard and preached many sermons on how we as Christians need to have faith like Peter's, a faith that would push us to get out of the boat. When we have that kind of faith, these sermons usually say, we are able to do things that otherwise seem impossible. When we really are committed to following Jesus, we're empowered to do the things he's calling us to, even if they are as improbable as walking on water in the middle of a storm. These sermons also usually make the point that we have to leave behind the relative safety of our boats and step into the chaotic, stormy seas into which Jesus is calling us. And probably, at some point, there's the point made that Peter begins to sink when he takes his eyes off the source of that call, Jesus, and focuses more on the waves and the wind that are battering him. That would be a pretty good sermon. I bet the ones you've heard that were along those lines were inspiring and helped you have a little more faith to do the hard but right things you already knew Jesus was calling you into. It maybe helped you practice more discipline in keeping your focus not on the barriers to following the call, but on Jesus instead. But the reason that there's controversy over this interpretation and all the sermons that rely on it is that Peter's very act of getting out of the boat maybe isn't an act of faith at all. In fact, if we remember what the passage actually says, Jesus identifies himself to the disciples and then tells them not to fear. And Peter's response to that is to doubt that it's really Jesus. In fact, Peter is testing Jesus, and we know that that is not cool. Jesus' response to Peter's doubt, his demand that he too be able to walk on water, is for Jesus to just say, "All right, come on." And Peter steps out of the safety of the boat, where the disciples are not in danger of dying, you'll recall. He leaves his community. He leaves the place Jesus actually told him to be and walks into the unknown chaos, all because he doesn't believe that the person telling him not to fear is really Jesus. So he takes this needless risk because of his doubt. And he maybe realizes he's in the midst of the waves and the wind, and he cries out as he sinks to be saved. Now that is a very different sermon. That's a sermon about us needing to be faithful to the call we have already received, to rely on our community in the midst of the storms, to put aside our skepticism and remain faithful even when things seem impossible. That's not a sermon about taking fateful risks at all. It's a sermon about trusting where Jesus has placed you and that you are going to be safe there. It's also about how our discipleship becomes meaningful and important in the trajectory of our lives when we trust and are obedient to Jesus, not when we demand that he prove himself to us on our terms. Honestly, I think both of those are pretty good sermons. And there are probably times when both of them are the word that we need to hear. Sometimes we do have to take a risk and follow a call, trusting that Jesus will catch us when we start to sink. But sometimes we've already received the call, and we need to stay in the boat and continue on to shore, even when we are unsure and full of doubt, and even when we can't quite be sure it's still Jesus there in the midst of that storm. But here's the thing about both of these different messages. Whether we read Peter's actions as being a faithful risk or the result of his inability to believe, Jesus still saves him in the end. And Jesus' identity as the Son of God is still revealed to those in the boat because of it. When we're called into the chaos of something new, when we're asked to ignore the storm and follow the voice bidding us come, Jesus is with us in that. When we need to stay put, to rely on the strength of the community that's in the boat with us on the way to the other shore, on the way to the next place where we will do the work of Jesus, he's with us in that too. We call him Emmanuel, God with us, for a reason. Because when we are faithful or foolhardy, obedient or obstinate, Jesus is still with us. I think this truth is actually sort of hard for a lot of lifelong Christians to internalize. We may imagine that the real challenge to our faith will be something big, some walking on water moment where we were finally proved to ourselves how we've been changed by knowing Jesus, how we are imbued with an amazing power, or maybe when we were drowning and pulled back out. And maybe we're still waiting, because a lot of us don't have some dramatic story, and we maybe never will. We've been low-key obedient for a lifetime, never leaving the boat, but also never being called to walk on water. But none of that means that Jesus is not with us. So the thing that I want you to take away and then go do this week is to think about what it means that Jesus is with you no matter what. No one had really asked me that question until I was in seminary. And honestly, that day when the question was posed to me, having to sit and think about it was really hard, but it was important. We often so much prize the stories that are like Peter's, where someone walks on water or is drowning and gets saved at the last minute, that we don't stop and think about the quiet persistence of faith and how it has been slowly shaping us, maybe even since birth. We like the proof that comes with drama, and we fail to recognize the grace that's in the ordinary. Now, my answer to that question of what it means to know that Jesus is with me is that without knowing that Jesus is with me and always has been, I wouldn't have any hope at all. That's my answer, and I'm looking forward to hearing yours.